So, where does the idea of Romeo and Juliet come from? It's quite interesting that when I tell people that the plots of the majority of Shakespeare plays are actually lifted from other sources, they're often very, very surprised by this. But Shakespeare's the greatest writer of all time. You're telling me he didn't come up with his own ideas? Nothing is real. Life is a lie. How will I continue? It's a hard truth, but you tend to find that, with the rare exception, Shakespeare vastly improves both the content and the form of the stories he lifts from. And Romeo and Juliet is no different. It's pretty unanimously understood that Shakespeare's main inspiration for the play was a long narrative poem called Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet by one Arthur Brooke. Brooke was a poet who drowned in a shipwreck in 1563, and that's literally all I can find on him. Well, apart from the fact that he was part of something known as the Inner Temple, which is not as cool as it sounds, just like a fancy law school founded by the Templars. Okay, so it's kind of cool. His version is slightly more depressing, shall we say, than Shakespeare's. In addition to everyone who already dies, the nurse is exiled, the apothecary is hanged, and Friar Lawrence is locked in the monastery for the rest of his life. Yeah, Brooke's pretty harsh. I mean, in the first page, he describes the lovers as, and I quote, "a couple of unfortunate lovers thralling themselves to unhonest desire, neglecting the authority and advice of parents and friends, conferring their principal counsels with drunken gossips and superstitious friars, the natural fit instruments of unchastity, attempting all adventures of peril for the attaining of their wished lust, using oracular confession, the key of whoredom and treason for furtherance of their purpose, abusing the honourable name of lawful marriage to cloak the shame of stolen contracts, finally, by all means of unhonest life, hasting to most unhappy death." So yeah, Shakespeare does lighten the tone a bit. Brooke seems to have translated the story from Pierre Boutuzov to how do you pronounce it? I can't pronounce. I'm sorry. Was a French humanist writer, editor, translator, and compiler. He in turn got it from Matteo Bondello, an Italian scholar, monk, soldier, writer, and bishop, an all-round and very multi-talented gentleman who was made famous for his novellas. Luigi da Porta, another Italian writer, if you couldn't tell, gave the older Italian folk story much of its form and gave most of the characters the names we now recognise. The actual physical documents we have of the play are both quartos. Quarto 1 from 1597, or the Bad Quarto, as the scholars rather judgmentally have named it, seems to be an actor's kind of dodgy recollection that he sold on the sly. You know, actors, they've got to eat. Its Juliet has about 40% less lines than Quarto 2. Quarto 2 is from 1599. It's the text that is used in 90% of modern publications and is slightly larger. It's thought to be copied from one of Shakespeare's actual manuscripts, though there is no conclusive evidence for this, and scholars, as they are wont to do, are still arguing over that. Jumping back to Brooks, now, shall we put it, more blistering disapproval of Romeo and Juliet, we have to look at the prevailing historical opinions of the time. Many would assume, somewhat rightly let's be honest, that the attitudes surrounding the play's themes, teenage love, sex, marriage, feminism, were not exactly positively viewed by the general populace in Shakespeare's time. It was not exactly a libertine paradise, Elizabethan England. Indeed, our modern idea of equality between the sexes would be completely foreign to the Elizabethan mindset. There was an inherent difference between the genders, so why not treat them differently? After all, Eve's, cheeky nibble of the apple in the Garden of Eden was the factually accepted reason for mankind's downfall and all the myriad ills associated with it. And yeah, the law definitely reflected that, despite a female being on the throne. Women could not vote in parliamentary or mayoral elections, be a justice of the peace, a lawyer, a mayor, or an alderman. The only profession she could actually have was that of a licensed surgeon, but only one woman in the entirety of Elizabeth I's reign received such a license. Women could not practice trades or businesses in a town unless it was in conjunction with their husband or after his death. Once married, the restrictions only increased. All of her property was legally her husband's, including anything she might inherit. She could not sign a legal document without her husband's permission, including her own last will and testament, and as long as he did not kill her, her husband was legally allowed to beat his wife with impunity. In addition to all this, she would be expected to run the household and all the chores that entailed. washing the clothes, linens, bedding, ensuring there was enough food and firewood for the family, and raising the children basically independently. So, you might quite rightly ask, why would Juliet ever want to marry Romeo, never mind suggest it herself? Well, seemingly in conflict with what I said earlier, England notoriously offered women more freedom than other parts of Europe at the time. I mean, look at us. The observant among you will point out that Romeo and Juliet is set in Italy. However, it was written for an English audience with English attitudes, and as such you see that reflected in the play. Shakespeare never left the British Isles, and thus has no reference for contemporary European attitudes beyond the very limited literature of the period. Many Swiss and German visitors remarked with shock that they saw women wandering around free without being accompanied by men. Some even played ball games out in the open. Such horror! This relative liberty was also reflected in the way in which marriage was handled as well. Marriage contracts were most often organised by the parents of the girl, especially in noble families where it was just, another part of the quarrels and vendettas as they tried to gain more wealth, power and prestige, allying and offending other families. The feuding of the Montagues and Capulets reflects a well-known aspect of Elizabethan England. Violence was commonplace, these feuds not uncommon. For example, the Percy and Neville family had an infamous rivalry in England. In addition, duelling, as seen in the play, was a familiar practice. Even Jonson and Marlowe, Shakespeare's contemporary playwrights, were often involved in their own duels. Young men who percentage-wise numbered 5 times more than they do today. A huge slice of the population often wore rapiers if they could afford them, and fought in the very streets in which Romeo and Juliet was originally performed. But despite politics and violence often being more of a reason for marriage than love, the bride's consent, under duress or not, was considered extremely important. The church consistently treated the willingness of the bride as a condition for marriage. The Elizabethan Book of Common Prayer required the clergyman publish pamphlets for 3 Sundays before the wedding, asking parishioners to come forward and present reasons it shouldn't happen. If either of you do know any impediment why ye may not be lawfully joined together in matrimony, then that ye confess it. This is why, within the play, we see initially Capulet being rather cautious about the idea of Juliet's marriage, and Lady Capulet's desire for Juliet's approval of the match. Even when Capulet threatens her later on, you'll notice it isn't, "You're doing this, no questions asked," it's, "You're doing this, or I'm disowning you." It's a small difference, you might think, but it's huge legally in the Elizabethan age. Courtship represented the one time in a patriarchal society when the woman held the reins, so it's probably not a huge surprise Juliet takes advantage of this. And just to clear this up, in Elizabethan England, the age of consent was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. So yes, still very but not illegal technically at the time. Marriage was considered holy, still pretty universally, which is why Juliet doesn't just lie and marry Paris while Romeo is in Mantua. Bigamy, marrying 2 people, was considered a huge sin, and, having married Romeo, a marriage to Paris would be considered heretical in the eyes of God, at least according to the religious thought at the time. Of course, it's important to point out that their suicides would also have been considered a sin, most likely an unforgivable one. But Shakespeare, unlike Brooke, does not focus on that. Instead, he frames Romeo and Juliet as protagonists to be pitied, not a cautionary tale. He presents a female defying all societal norms and expectations, marrying and killing herself for love as a good guy. And the Elizabethan public, male and female, well, they loved it. We know it was one of the most popular plays even at the time, with many poets praising and blatantly ripping it off. So, to suggest Elizabethans were all sexist and disapproved of female autonomy in light of this is a touch unnuanced, I would say, especially when one considers many of Shakespeare's heroines, Rosalind, Portia, Viola, etc. History is usually far more complicated than we give it credit for, and I just seek to remind everyone that these were just people, exactly like you and me, confined almost universally by the morality of their time. Unsurprisingly, therefore, the popularity and critiques of Romeo and Juliet have shifted throughout history, and the critiques they started right away. Already in 1598, John Marston, a contemporary poet and satirist of Shakespeare, was mocking playgoers who kept quoting the play as fops. "I set thy lips a broach, for whence doth flow naught but pure Juliet and Romeo." The image of a lover suspended above the other in a window instantly captured the imagination, and it was parodied or blatantly ripped off a fair few times. Henry Porter's The Two Angry Women of Abingdon in 1599 directly satirises Romeo and Juliet by having the feud be between two housewives rather than ancient families. He has his own window scene with the lovers Maud and Philip that is far bawdier than Shakespeare's, much more rude, bordering on smut at several points. The aforementioned John Marston also has a window scene in his own play, Jack Drum's Entertainment in 1601. However, this time, 3 suitors come to the window, and only the last of whom is Catherine's true love. These are both comedies, so it might seem odd to compare them, but it proves that this image of the window scene was ingrained enough in the Elizabethan consciousness that it could be recognisably parodied. They both also expose further the rather scandalous idea that a woman can be openly sexual and still the sympathetic protagonist. Both Maud and Catherine are far more openly sexual than Juliet, and existing comedies both get relatively happy endings. This exploration reaches its natural conclusion with John Ford's "'Tis Pity She's a Whore", 1633. It doesn't directly reference Romeo and Juliet like Porter and Marston, but the similarities are many. Both share a forbidden love looked down on by society. Both have a friar who counsels the lovers as well as a nurse or tutoress, and both lovers end up dying tragic deaths. Of course, the difference is that Ford's lovers are brother and sister, but the question and themes remain the same. By alluding to the innocence of the earlier play, Ford draws the contrast as he explores the darker themes of his own play. Obviously, once we hit 1642 and the Puritan Long Parliament closes down the London theatres, we don't see much of Romeo and Juliet. Bloody Cromwell! Though again, the themes of open female sexuality made Puritans hate it even more than they hated the rest of theatre. Yay! Luckily, with the restoration of Charles II in 1660, they reopen, though Romeo and Juliet, and much of Shakespeare, is considered rather unfashionable during the restoration. Famously, Samuel Pepys called Romeo and Juliet the worst play that I have ever heard in my life. Aristotle's unities of time, place and action were now what dictated good plays, and Romeo and Juliet does not fit easily into Aristotle's definition of tragedy. When it was performed, it was often heavily censored, removing Juliet's open sexual language and Mercutio's boyness. There was still a fair amount of respect for Shakespeare, though. Thomas Otway adapted the play into the neoclassical format for his own play, The History and Fall of Caius Marius. Seemingly a political piece drawing parallels between ancient Roman consulship and the potential succession of the Catholic James II, it very, very closely resembles Romeo and Juliet. Marius and Lavinia are our lovers in this play, and Otway pays more attention to the split of loyalties that the lovers have rather than what Shakespeare does. Romeo and Juliet almost relish in their disloyalty to their families, whereas Marius and Lavinia desperately want not to be in love with each other, yet they cannot help it. It's also the first time we get this idea of Juliet, or Lavinia in this case, waking up in time to see and talk to her lover before he succumbs to the poison, rather than waking up alone. As we move into the 1700s, Shakespeare's popularity re-emerges thanks almost single-handedly to a man named David Garrick, an actor, playwright and theatre manager whose Shakespeare Festival in Stratford brought the Bard's works back into the mainstream and put Stratford, thankfully for me, on the map. His version of Romeo and Juliet, though based on the text of the original, has many alterations similar to Thomas Otway's. Garrick cut a huge amount, including the chorus, the prologue, any reference to Rosaline, the entire character of Lady Montague, and what he called the jingle and quibble. Punning and wordplay was still wildly unfashionable, so a lot of Mercutio's jokes were cut, as were a lot of Juliet's lines. Romeo becomes more consistent and less fickle, while Juliet becomes less active and philosophically questioning. Her sexual language was still heavily censored. The lovers are presented as pathetic victims rather than active agents in their own tragedy. You can see this in the grand funeral scene that Garrick gives to Juliet after her fake death. He also adds in a scene of his own creation where, much like Otway, Juliet wakes up in time to have a full-blown conversation with Romeo before they die. All these alterations were designed to make the tragedy more palatable to an audience used to the neoclassical style, hence the streamlining and focus on fitting neatly into the genre of tragedy. The idea of pity is an essential element of Aristotle's idea of tragedy. The pity in the play was not universally accepted, however, with many, including one of the first female Shakespearean critics, Charlotte Lennox, pointing out that the play had weaknesses in a neoclassical sense. Lennox marks these flaws up to Shakespeare not having access to the original Bondello and relying instead on the flawed, as she sees it, the French and Brooke versions. Of course, these are only weaknesses when viewed through this neoclassical lens. The famous writer Samuel Johnson, however, enthusiastically disagreed with the neoclassical critique and called the play a particular favourite despite the lack of unities. However, like Garrick, he would often point out plot holes and overly flamboyant, ununiform language in places he viewed as inappropriate. Moving swiftly through the early 1800s, and people start caring less and less about the unity and strict genre lines. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge saw it as a progression of Shakespeare's tragedy writing, rather than the immature first try it had previously been thought of. The Romantics were far less bothered by Juliet's open sexual language than previous critics, and people like Coleridge praised the beauty and purity of both the content and form of Romeo and Juliet, unlike previously where the form was often heavily criticised. It became a more popular play in the Victorian era, and it became quite fashionable for a time for both Romeo and Juliet to be played by a woman. One of the leading actresses at the time, Helena Fawcett, wrote a book on her experiences playing female Shakespeare characters, and her insights into Juliet and how she was received at the time is fascinating. She makes it very clear that only by playing the lovers as guiltless victims does the play work. She talks intensely about the many layers of Juliet, the excitement, the childishness, the frankness, the courage, the inquisitiveness, and the intelligence. Clearly, the Victorian audiences were wanting more out of their Juliets. Interestingly, it's by far the most popular Shakespeare to have been adapted into opera, with over 30 individual adaptations on its own, which I just think is quite an interesting thing to say. Critically, it started to fall on hard times as we hit the turn of the century. A.C. Bradley, a very famous Shakespearean scholar, barely mentions it in his seminal Shakespearean tragedy, which shows his slight disdain for putting it in that category. H.B. Charlton said, "Romeo and Juliet are historically unimportant. They lack the pomp of historical circumstances and are, in effect, just a boy and a girl in a novel. It lacks inevitability." He considered the feud inadequate for purpose, being merely sporadic. For example, Capulet is quite willing to accept Romeo as an uninvited guest at his ball, which kind of weakens the idea that all Capulets hate all Montagues. It did see a resurgence in performance though. Laurence Olivier and John Gielgud shared the roles of Mercutio and Romeo against Peggy Ashcroft's Juliet in 1935 at the Old Vic Theatre. One review said, "Mr. Olivier's Romeo showed himself very much in love, but rather butchered the poetry, whereas Mr. Gielgud carves the verse exquisitely, yet is this Romeo ever really in love with anybody except himself?" As you can see, a more logical, consequence-driven analysis started to take hold, often called new criticism. It gave less reverence to past works and systems of analysis and placed more stock in consistency and an obvious through line for the plot and characters. Obviously, work on Romeo and Juliet continued well through into the 20th century, but we've kind of hit the end of what I would consider the historical period, so I won't touch on them. I've often covered a lot of their works and theories in my literary analysis video. However, these are often still debated, so I'm hesitant to call them canon or fixed history like the rest of this has been. But I hope you found this informative, both in terms of kind of the history of why Romeo and Juliet exists and how it's been viewed through time. Moving on to another play now. I think Macbeth probably should be fun. So just stick around for that. Please like and subscribe. And if it helped you, let me know in a comment or something. Thank you so much, everyone. Parting is such sweet sorrow that I shall bid thee good night till it be morrow. Bye.
Alack the day when one begins to beg, when the powers above thou hast to bribe, but if thou this fine channel wish to peg, then, good fellows, I implore you, subscribe. Alas, but still thou shalt not be informed if this author a tale he has to tell. My heart would thus be eternally warmed, if like cries of yore thou ring'st the bell. last, if thou finds an item thou dost enjoy, allow me yet another deal to strike. Thine patronage I would seek to employ, therefore, fine friend, feel free to drop a like. But now we end, and I wish thee luck, and pray thou friends, forgive this rambling